Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be taking a look at two new items. We have the new Dior. This is L'Atelier Mauve. So this is the limited edition palette. It started as an Asia exclusive and it was just released here in the US. And we also have the new Sisley Phyto-Teint Perfection. I've been wearing this for about a week. Let's start off with the Sisley foundation. You can see here that the bottle is frosted glass. It is a nice compact bottle, but we still have a full ounce of product, 30 milliliters. It's made in France, and we have a 1-year shelf life. So Sisley has recently expanded their shade range for their foundations. It was pretty dismal before, but it's still a little bit of a guessing game. So I ended up with shade 00N Pearl. So we're going to take a look at that. And I have a few shade comparisons as well. I do have a little bit of a stain on my hand here, so just something to note. But here is the shade 00N Pearl. And let's just go ahead and buff a little bit of this in. So we're going to let this oxidize and dry and so forth. Then we'll test it with a fresh swatch after we talk about the details. So let's move on to the demos. So as I mentioned, I've been wearing this foundation for about a week. It's been 5 days now to be exact. And I have a few different wear tests and demos here for you to see how it performs. And each of them is on top of a different primer. So the first one we have on top of Chanel Le Beige Frosty White primer. And then the second one's on top of my favorite Surat Perfectioniste primer, which is a bit more, I wouldn't say it's truly a mattifying product, but it does reduce all of your oils without actually drying your skin. So that one's gonna be a bit more mattifying. And then we also have it on top of the Cle de Peau. This is the Brightening Enhancer Veil. So I have demos on top of those, but I did also try it on top of the Euphoria primer, which is a moisturizing primer and acts more as a moisturizer or a lotion for your face. So I have to say, the first day that I used this foundation, I really wasn't sure how I felt about it. So I used it on top of the Euphoria first. Actually, very first, I used it on top of no primer. But I do recommend a primer with this because I think it helps kind of smooth out imperfections in your skin. And otherwise, this will kind of hug onto all of those. So you really want to start off with a nice base. So on top of the Euphoria, I built it up. And I built it up more to a high coverage finish. And I feel like although this formula it's marketed as a mattifying, transfer-proof, high coverage foundation, I think it's really best as a medium coverage foundation. When I built it up as high coverage on top of a moisturizing primer, I felt like during the day, I could see a little bit of separation. So I felt like that really wasn't great. On top of the other primers, you can see on top of the Chanel and even today's Cle de Peau, those added a little bit of luminosity underneath the foundation. And, you know, on top of the Chanel, we went up more to a full coverage. And on top of the Cle de Peau today, we're at medium coverage. So you can kind of see the difference there. But I do think when you build this up to full coverage, regardless of your primer, you're still going to see some separation. The more moisturizing the primer is, the more separation I could see. Now, I do want to note that the separation that you see, it's not terrible. It's one that you see when you're up very close. But if you're talking to somebody, even, you know, they're 2 feet away from you, it's not really noticeable. It's really only if you're going to get up close to your skin. So I actually ended up really liking it on top of the Surat primer, but I have to say that if you build that up, I feel like then it can look a little bit dry. So in summation, this foundation is a little bit finicky. You really need to be careful to have a nice base. And I think that this is best at medium coverage. Once you build it up too much, I feel like you can see a little settling. Now in the demos and the close-ups, I wanted to show you where, you know, my eyes crinkle and so forth, so you could see how it sets in the lines. When you are smiling and crinkling, getting those wrinkles, you can see them. They're a little bit more emphasized that way, but they don't stay that way. So once you kind of, you know, relax those muscles, then they fade. The lines don't like stay. It doesn't like crease up or anything like that. So yeah, overall, it's a finicky foundation. Let's take a look at some of the claims from Sisley. So this foundation retails for $125 US. According to Sisley, it's skincare and makeup as one. The Phyto-Teint Perfection is a high coverage mattifying foundation powered by the Ideal Skin Complex to improve the look of skin quality with each application. And they talk about identifying the external factors that impact the quality of your skin. And basically, they have 3 actions to help combat those. So those actions would be hydrating the skin immediately and intensely, smoothing the skin texture, and illuminating the complexion. Personally, I don't really find this hydrating. It's not drying on my skin, but it's really just sitting there. And if my base doesn't have moisture in it already, it does not look better with the foundation. Now, according to Sisley, it says instantly skin texture looks smooth and refined. With each application, the skin appears plumped and imperfections are less visible. Phyto-Teint Perfection Foundation gives a naturally radiant matte finish. Its ultra long-lasting, transfer-proof formula has an undetectable texture for flawless skin and day-long comfort. It offers medium to high buildable coverage with no cakey effect. Phyto-Teint Perfection visibly blurs imperfections and minimizes pores. The complexion appears enhanced and more even. In a word, perfect. And they have 29 shades. Now, I would have to say, I actually think it is a nice foundation, but I don't think it's a great foundation. I think this is actually a really nice looking matte foundation, but as I mentioned, application I feel like is a little bit finicky. If you put on too much or if you put on too little, you don't necessarily get the best benefits. So you kind of have to play around with this one a little bit to really get the best application and just kind of, make it work for you. And once you do figure out what your best application is with it, I think it's a really beautiful foundation on the skin. So for me personally, I think this is a nice matte foundation. It's one that I will wear, but it's also one that I won't wear if my skin is not in great condition because, again, I don't have the luxury of being able to build it up in certain areas to hide any blemishes or anything, because then I do feel like it's not that it looks cakey, but it can look a little dry. It almost looks like you have foundation that's been powdered, maybe put a little too much powder on. And so that's just not the effect that I want. So it's a nice foundation when you get it just right, but otherwise, I think up close, it's not always great. Let's take a look at that swatch here. So this is our older shade here. I'm gonna put the new one right next to it, so you can kind of see the shade difference. There is quite a bit of oxidation here. I mean, look at that difference. So I wanted to compare a couple other Sisley foundations. This is the Phyto-Teint Nude. This is their skin tint. I didn't really love this one, but I do have this in the lightest shade, which is 00N Snow. And it was just too light for me, but it also has sort of that pearly effect, making it look a little bit lighter than it actually is. So I wanted to show you the difference. I think for me personally, I would be right in between the two shades. That being said, I do like the shade that I ended up with, the 00N Pearl, and I think it works for me, but I just think the perfect shade would be in between the two. Now, one of my all-time favorite foundations is the Sisley Cushion, and I have this in the lightest shade for the cushion, which is 00C Swan. So this, though, I love this foundation, but it is not the best shade. You can see, I'm going to put this one right down here so you can kind of see how that compares. But it's a little bit deeper and a little bit peachier than the pearl shade, the 00N. But you can see the depth of color is pretty similar. The 00C is ever so slightly deeper, but it's really more the peachiness that makes it a little bit different. So I absolutely love the Cushion foundation. It's one of my favorites of all. So even though it's not a perfect color match, I still use this. I've gone through refills on this. So I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you've tried the Sisley foundation or what your thoughts are on it, what you think it looks like on my skin. I'd love to hear those in the comments. Let's move on to the Dior palette. So this Dior palette, this is limited edition and it's a little bit higher price. It's at $70 US. This is number 943 L'Atelier Mauve. And let's go ahead and swatch these. But you can see we have this beautiful like embossing on here, like a dressmaker embossing. I'm gonna make these just a little bit wider just because I'm trying not to ruin the embossing here. So this is our first shade, which is gonna be a very pale lavender with a bit of a pearly finish. Next up, we have this very, very light, kind of a frosty light pink. And you can see it's a really pretty shade, but these are going to be pretty light. Our middle shade is going to be a deeper pink here. And again, I'm trying not to ruin the embossing, so it's a little bit harder to get up much product, but it is coming up very easily. So there's no issue with the product in the pan here. You can see we have more of a medium pink here, but I would have to say that the formula of these, it's a little bit on the more powdery side, meaning that it doesn't necessarily adhere super strongly to your lids. So, you know, you are going to get kind of a lighter application if you're using a brush with this. If you want more pigmentation, I would recommend using your fingers or using these shadows wet. So when we're looking at the eye swatches, we'll do the 5 shadows, and then on the 6th eye, we'll do a wet application of some of the shades. So this is the palette here. Let's take a look at the eye swatches and the demos. So this palette has 7 grams of product. We have our typical Dior shelf life of 6 months. It's made in France and it is limited edition. Overall, I think these shades are really beautiful. They are very light and soft, very spring with the light purple and pink. As I mentioned, the first shade is kind of a soft pearly lavender. It does have a bit of pink in there, so it does have a pink hue to it. None of these purples are very blue. They all have a little bit of pink in them. The next shade is more of this frosty, really pale pink, almost white. Think of like one of those like ballet pink nail polishes, you know, I can't think of it, you know, the classic Essie shade that is barely seen on your nails. That's kind of the color of the second shade here. Our middle shade is kind of a medium pink, and although you don't really notice it, there is a little bit of sparkle in there. So there's a tiny bit of shimmer and it's pretty subtle. The next shade there is going to be a slightly deeper pink than our second shade. There's a little bit more pink to it, but it is pretty close to the second shade. And last up, we have more of a orchid shade. And this one is a satin matte finish. Overall, I think it's a really beautiful palette. The formula on this is okay. So as we've looked at the new formulas for the Dior palettes, some of them have been fine, some of them have been not so great. This one it goes in the category of fine. So there's nothing wrong with the formulas, but it's just not a special formula either. Now, I think that's part of the reason though that this applies very lightly with a brush on the lids. So I think, you know, it's a more powdery texture versus a creamier texture. So you don't have quite as much grip. So if you're using a brush, you definitely are going to get a very light, soft application, which can be very brightening on the eyes, very spring appropriate. But if you want to see more pigment and you really want to see colors in there, I definitely like the wet application of this. So that's what I did today for the final look here. I have a little bit of dry for the creases, but then the lid is mostly that first shade there, that soft lavender, and it's wet. And it's going to be a little bit frostier when it's wet, but I do think you get a really nice light reflection and sheen from it, and you can see the true colors a little bit more. So before we move on to the comparisons, I wanted to show you a quick demo of me using 2 of these shades, the bottom left and the middle shade. I kind of mix them together as blush. And that's what I have on my cheeks right now. It gives you a little bit of a pearly effect, so you don't need an additional highlighter. And I think it's a really pretty color. Actually, I really like these shades in general for blush. And yeah, I think that makes this palette a little bit more versatile and a little bit more worth buying than if you were just using it on the eyes. Let's take a look at just a few comparisons. So the first comparison is, of course, the 849 Pink Sakura. This was a limited edition one a couple of years ago, and it was hard to get. I really wanted to take a look at this first shade here and see how that compares to the first shade. But you can see that the Pink Sakura lavender is going to have a bit more blue in it. So I'm going to go ahead and just swatch this whole palette right here vertically so we can see how that looks. All right, so here is the Pink Sakura palette, and you can see it's a really beautiful color story. It definitely has more of those pinky mauve tones. although this one's called L'Atelier Mauve, it's really going to be more of a soft orchid shade versus true mauves. So it doesn't really match up with the pink Sakura at all. And for the name L'Atelier Mauve, I would have loved if they had brought this one back, but I do think that this new palette is also really pretty. This is the new Dior Pink Organza, number 123, and we're going to take a look at this light pink here in the middle and see how that compares. In the pan, it looks the closest to this pink right here, and you can see that they are close, but the Pink Organza pink is a little bit cooler in tone. And then this one here is Blooming Bouquet. So we're going to take a look at the lavender shade in the middle there as well and see how this compares. It kind of looks like it might be closest to one of these first two shades. We're going to put this right here at the top, but you can see it doesn't really go with anything in this new palette. It's definitely going to be a little bit cooler. There's a little bit more blue in the base there, but overall you can see we have a really pretty palette, but the main purpose people will buy this most likely is for the embossing. The embossing is gorgeous. So in summation, I would have to say that I think both products that we looked at today are very nice. I do actually like the Sisley foundation, but it's a like, not a love. It's one that I will definitely wear. I think it gives a nice matte finish. And now that I kind of figured out what type of application and primer I like best in combination on my skin, I think it's definitely one that I can use on a regular basis. But if you get this and you don't really like it the first use, I would definitely encourage you to try again, because I think this one, it really is dependent on what the base is like, your skincare base, as well as your application method. For application, I did find that a brush like this is the BK Beauty 101, and you can see it's like a bit softer. That really gave a better, application to it versus something a little bit stiffer like this Koh Gen Do. So this is a little bit firmer, it's a little bit denser, and I feel like with this one you can see brush lines a little bit more easily with the foundation versus something a little bit softer with more flexibility. So just something to note there. I think those little factors can make a big difference in how the foundation looks, but overall I do like it. I would give that a B. As for the Dior palette, I would also give that one a B. I think the embossing is great. The colors are nice, very nice for spring. I do wish that there were some shades, maybe like one shade that's a little bit more pigmented. They definitely have nice pigmentation when you use them wet, but they're still going to be soft and light. So I do wish that maybe there was something in there that was a little bit more different or a little bit more special, perhaps even like a duochrome type of shade that was a little bit deeper that you could use as a base. So, I think it's a nice palette, but the main reason people will love this most likely is for the embossing, but it is really pretty on the eyes. So overall, I think both products were nice and I'm happy with them. I'd love to know your thoughts, so please share them down below in the comments. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you very soon. Have a great day.